All right, let's do part 4 of biomes and global ecology. So we've been talking about biomes. We've been talking about how latitude is a very important factor in determining biomes. Let's talk about another one of these biomes in particular, and also let's put some more biology into this fourth and final part of the lecture. I know this topic has been relatively biology poor. It's been a lot of big topics of like Earth weather and climate, and we haven't really been talking about specific organisms, so let's do that a little bit now. And we're going to use as our example the Mediterranean climate, which isn't exactly a biome. It's a little bit more specific than that. The Mediterranean climate is defined as having a relatively warm and mild and a bit of a wet winter and a hot and dry summer. So you can think Spain, Italy, Greece, but you can also think of west coast of California, west coast of South America, Chile, for example, western South Africa, west side of Australia, but also the eastern edges of Asia. There's a reason why the western edges of these continents often have these climates, and it has to do with ocean currents and weather patterns that we've already talked about. And it's been noticed for as long as Europeans, at least, have been traveling around the world, that you tend to find similar types of organisms, especially plants, in places where you have a similar climate, specifically this Mediterranean climate. And so this is one of the classic examples of convergent evolution, which is that similar environmental conditions, for example, similar climates, should select for similar organisms, regardless of their evolutionary history. So even though you may not find the same types of plants taxonomically or phylogenetically in California and Italy, the plants that are there are going to have similar traits because of convergent evolution, because the conditions in each of those places are selecting for similar traits, even if they are in different organisms. So we're going to spend the whole rest of this lecture exploring that concept. So if it's a little fuzzy right now, that's okay. We're going to get specific. So here is what is known as the chaparral in Southern California, rolling hills, small shrubs, and maybe some medium-sized trees, a particular type of soil that is also good for growing wine, by the way, as in Greece. Instead of being called the chaparral, it is called the matoral. Probably not pronouncing that exactly correctly. I don't know Greek. And it looks, roughly similar. You've got rolling hills, you've got medium-sized trees and shrubs, and you also have good wine. In Chile, instead of the chaparral or the matoral, it is called the maqui. And again, rolling hills, soil good for wine. You'll find Chilean wine as well as Greek wine and California wine at the liquor store. And plants look relatively similar. But instead of me just saying that in gross generalizations like this, let's get specific. So here is an extremely common plant in California known as a dinostoma, and a very common plant in Chile called Satureia. You can see that they have similar leaves. They have these clusters of really fine, thin leaves in both of these plants. They have similar canopies. So the dinostoma in California has the shrubby shape like this, and the Satureia in Chile has a shrubby appearance like this. And so my question for you is, are these homologous traits or are these analogous traits? So think about that for a second. Is the shape of the plant, like this and this, and the shapes of their leaves, are those homologous traits or are they analogous traits? And when you are asked this question, homologous or analogous, the way that you should translate that in your mind is, were these traits inherited from a common ancestor to the both of them? Did their ancestor look like this? If this is homologous, then the ancestor of both of these plants also had the same trait. Or did this come about by convergent evolution? in which case the ancestor of these two plants would not necessarily have the same trait of the canopy that looks like this or the leaves that look like this. And two plants might have both analogous and homologous traits, which is a complicated thing. But for now, let's focus on these two. I'll tell you the answer is the same for both of these traits. And the answer actually is not obvious unless we have more information. Because unless you happen to know what taxonomic group Adenostoma belongs to and what taxonomic group Saturea belongs to, because you're already a plant biologist, then you actually can't answer that question yet. In order to answer that question, we need to know the phylogeny. We need to know who their relatives are, who we predict their ancestors are, in order to answer this question. So let's look at that. Here is a phylogeny of the rosids, which is one group of the eudicots of angiosperms. So we've already zoomed pretty far into one subgroup within the angiosperms. The Adenostoma, which the common name for that is California chamise, I actually don't know how to pronounce that, is within the Rosales, which is the same group that includes plants like the rose and cannabis, are all members of the same Rosales group, as well as this Adenostoma that we've been talking about. And the Saturea from Chile that we've been talking about, that looks just like the Adenostoma, is in a completely different group, the Asterids, which also includes things like rosemary and snapdragon. So now, do you have enough information to tell me whether the canopy shape and the leaf shape of these two plants is analogous or homologous? And again, the question is, does the common ancestor to both of these plants, which would be way back here, it's covered up by the photos, would that also have the same leaf shape and the same canopy shape as these two plants? And the answer is no, because we have no reason to think that the ancestor of all of these plants, which also includes things like rosemary and snapdragon and rose and cannabis and all sorts of other plants, why would they look like this? Right? Therefore, the shape of this one plant in the Rosales and this one plant in the Asterids must have come about by a convergent evolution, that they have no meaningful evolutionary recent history. Their ancestor goes way back and includes lots of other things that look nothing like them, and therefore these two particular traits that they have must have occurred because of convergent evolution, because they live in similar environmental conditions, which is this Mediterranean climate. So they are analogous. These two particular traits are analogous. Organisms are never homologous or analogous. It doesn't make any sense to talk about a whole organism being homologous. Individual traits or individual genes can be homologous or analogous. So these two particular traits are analogous for these two organisms. That is, they were not inherited from a common ancestor. Okay, let's do another example. Here's Quercus from California and Quiaja, I'm not sure, Quiaja from Chile. They have similar leaf appearances. Again, the Quercus is from the California chaparral, the Quiaja is from the Chile maqui. They have similar shapes of their canopy. This is what the Quercus looks like. This is what the Quiaja looks like. And so if I asked you if these are homologous or analogous, you would say, well, I'm not an expert in the taxonomy of Quercus, and therefore I don't have enough information to answer your question. And so let's look at the phylogeny. And so it turns out the Quercus, which is California scrub oak, by the way, all oaks belong to the same genus of Quercus, so all oaks are different species of the same genus. It is in this group called the Fagales. This is the same tree we showed before, by the way. This is where the roses were. Scrub oak is in the Fagales. Other members of the Fagales include things like this Tychodendron and a sweet fern, which is not really a fern, but you can see how its leaves sort of look like a fern, even though it's actually a member of this angiosperm group that also includes all oaks. And the Quiaja is also called the Chile soapbark tree. It's a member of a different group, the Fabales, which only differs by a single letter, but as you can see on this tree, they're distinct groups. Other members of this group include things like this milkwort flower and the tuberous pea, So it's a pea that produces edible tubers rather than edible pea pods. And so now you can answer my question of whether the shapes of the leaves of the scrub oak and the soapbark tree and the shapes of the canopy are homologous or analogous. And the answer is yes, analogous, because the common ancestor of these two organisms, which would have been right here, we have no reason to think would have looked like this, because it is also the ancestor of things like peas and milkworts and sweet ferns and tychodendrons and all sorts of other kinds of things that we would call flowers. Okay, so another example of convergent evolution producing analogous structures. And if we were doing clicker questions, this would be the question. Again, same thing I just said. So just to reinforce it, you should always associate in your mind analogous with convergent evolution. Convergent evolution always produces analogous traits. And then homologous traits are always inherited from a common ancestor. So the ancestor of both of the organisms under consideration would have had that same trait if it is homologous. So hopefully this helps us clear up this concept that I think has been a little bit tricky for us. And also I wanted to cover this again to point out that it is in fact a tricky concept, not just for students of Biology 1620, but in general. And scientists are frequently arguing about whether traits are analogous or homologous because it's not always obvious, and it depends on the phylogenetic history. So before we were able to make good phylogenies like this, which nowadays are informed by DNA sequencing, before we were able to sequence the genome of everything, or at least sequence genes of organisms, it was a lot murkier to prove to someone that the trait that you were studying was actually homologous. Because if the phylogeny changes based on your understanding of the evolutionary relationships to other organisms, which without DNA sequencing was just based on things like the shapes of leaves, then you can see how there would be fights about whether the shapes of leaves were homologous or analogous, and maybe one scientist was trying to argue that these two plants actually do belong to the same phylogenetic group, and therefore the shapes of their canopies are homologous. We know in this case that it's actually not true, but you can see that without having a good phylogeny, you actually can't answer the question of whether it is analogous or homologous. So when answering this question on a quiz or an exam, there will be information about the phylogeny, otherwise you can't answer the question. All right, once again, please send us questions, send me questions, send the other instructors questions, send questions to the learning assistants, and again, we'll figure out the logistics of the best way to handle your questions, but in the meantime, just send questions and we'll do the best we can. That's the end of this lecture, and we'll be posting the next lecture online at some point, and we will let you know. All right, I hope this worked out well for you. Please let us know if it didn't, and I'll see you next time.